A lonely widow in a small town is turned away at every door, whispered about, and humiliated in the street, until the most feared biker in the county throws his jacket over her shoulders and calmly says, "She's my wife now." To the town, he's a monster from the past. To her, he might be the first person who truly stands up for her. But when a mysterious fire rips through a church stand and all the blame falls on his club, dark secrets, old crimes, and small-town power games explode into the open. As she risks everything to prove his innocence, and he fights to protect her from both the town and his own past, one question hangs over them. Will this shocking claim of "you're my wife now" save them both, or destroy the only chance at love and belonging they'll ever get? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The October morning air nipped at Evelyn's cheeks as she stood at the end of her driveway, clutching the last cardboard box of Harold's belongings. The weight of it pressed against her hip, a physical reminder of what she was finally letting go. A neighbor's sprinkler ticked steadily across browning grass, the water drops catching the early sunlight like scattered diamonds, creating tiny rainbows that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. Her eyes drifted to the mailbox, where her fingers found the familiar raised letters of Harold Mercer on a faded postcard stuck halfway inside. The sight made her chest tighten, just a little. That familiar squeeze of grief that had become as much a part of her day as breathing. She adjusted her sensible brown cardigan, buttoning the second button from habit. The wool was soft from years of wear, comforting against the morning chill. At 51, she'd grown used to carrying heavy things alone. Grocery bags, trash bins, and the invisible weight of silence that filled her home. Her hands, still faintly scented with the morning's laundry detergent, gripped the box's worn edges as she made her way up the short path to the house, careful to avoid the uneven brick that always caught her toe when she wasn't paying attention. From here, she could see most of Cherry Grove's main stretch, Dottie's diner with its chrome-bright windows reflecting the morning sun, the white church steeple pointing like a finger to the cloudless sky, and the brick library where she'd spent 15 years helping children find their perfect books, matching quiet ones with adventures and boisterous ones with mysteries that would settle them into corners for hours. Now those familiar buildings felt like old friends who didn't quite know what to say anymore, awkward in their concern, careful not to mention Harold's name. The kitchen table accepted the box with a soft thud that echoed in the empty house. A fine layer of dust danced up from the cardboard, catching in a beam of sunlight streaming through the window. Evelyn's hand lingered inside, finding Harold's old silver pocket watch buried beneath his college yearbook and fishing magazines. The metal was cool against her palm as she set it aside, unable to pack it away just yet. She traced the monogram on its cover, HJM, with her thumb. The quiet house wrapped around her like a familiar but lonely blanket, the tick of the wall clock marking time that sometimes seemed to stand still. She went through the motions of making tea, kettle on the stove, Earl Grey in her favorite blue mug with the chip on the handle, 1 spoon of sugar stirred 3 times clockwise. The ritual was comforting in its predictability. As she waited for the water to boil, her mind wandered to the stack of quilting squares in the spare room, neatly cut from Harold's old flannel shirts, and the books she'd been collecting from yard sales and the library's discard pile. Maybe it's time, she murmured to herself, rehearsing the words she'd say later when courage found her. Just a small group, every other Thursday. We could read and quilt together, share stories and patterns. The idea had been growing for weeks now, taking root like the hardy mums in her garden that pushed through the soil despite the approaching frost. She pictured Margaret from 2 doors down, who'd recently lost her job at the bank, and whose curtains stayed drawn until nearly noon these days. Sarah across the street, whose kids had just left for college, leaving her wandering from room to room in her suddenly too big house. Even Mrs. Chen, who always smiled but rarely spoke since moving in last spring, her English halting but her eyes kind when they met Evelyn's at the mailbox. 5 doors. That would be a good start. 5 invitations to something that might grow into friendship, or at least a respite from solitude. The kettle whistled, a high-pitched cry that pulled her from her thoughts. Evelyn sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into her bones as she gathered her courage, like putting together pieces of a quilt, one square at a time, each stitch small but necessary. She'd start after lunch, when most people would be home, perhaps with a plate of the oatmeal cookies she'd baked yesterday, wrapped in wax paper the way her mother had taught her. Finally, she stood at her front door, keys in hand, her purse slung over her shoulder. Her shoulders straightened as she turned the lock, the sound sharp and definitive in the mid-morning quiet, like the period at the end of a long paragraph. It was time to stop hiding in memories and start stitching together something new. A patchwork community where she might find her place again. Eve smoothed her gray cardigan with trembling fingers and approached the first house on her list, its cheerful yellow trim and white porch railing a stark contrast to the butterflies in her stomach. Petunias nodded from hanging baskets, their purple and white blooms dancing in the gentle breeze. Mrs. Powell's collection of wind chimes, copper tubes and delicate glass pieces, tinkled softly in the afternoon air as Eve reached up and pressed the doorbell, her heart thumping against her ribs. "Oh, Evelyn, dear!" Mrs. Powell appeared in the doorway, her round face flushed from the kitchen heat, a flour-dusted apron covering her ample frame. 2 small children with identical blonde curls and curious eyes peeked around her legs, one clutching a wooden toy truck. "How are you holding up? We've been thinking about you." "I'm doing better each day, thank you." Eve managed a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but felt genuine enough. She clasped her hands to stop their slight trembling. "I'm actually starting a little quilting and reading group at my place, every other Thursday evening. I thought maybe you'd like to join us. Nothing fancy, just some coffee, conversation. Maybe we could work on a community project together." "Oh, honey." Mrs. Powell's face softened with that all-too-familiar look of sympathy that Eve had grown accustomed to since Harold's passing. "That's so thoughtful of you to include us, but with Tommy and Sarah here 3 days a week while their mama works, and my arthritis acting up something terrible." She gestured at the children, who were now openly staring at Eve. "Doctor says I need to take it easy with my hands. The last time I tried knitting, I couldn't hold a spoon for 2 days after." "Of course, I understand completely." Eve backed away from the door, careful not to show her disappointment, her practiced smile still firmly in place. "Maybe when the little ones are in school. You take care now." The Millers' brick ranch house was next on her route, newspapers scattered across their porch steps as though dropped in haste. The bold headline caught her eye. "Local factory announces layoffs. 100 jobs at risk." Eve's heart sank as she carefully stepped over the papers and rang the bell. John Miller answered the door in his work shirt, worry lines creasing his usually cheerful forehead, his shoulders slightly stooped. "Eve, nice to see you out and about," he said, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other, his smile not quite reaching his tired eyes. "We've missed seeing you at the community picnics." She explained her idea about the quilting group, watching his expression grow increasingly awkward as he glanced back into the house where the television murmured the afternoon news. That's really nice of you to think of us," he stammered, rubbing the back of his neck. "But with everything going on..." He glanced back at the scattered newspaper on the steps, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Mary's picking up extra shifts at the hospital. We're trying to save where we can right now. Gas money and all that." "No need to explain," Eve said quickly, patting his arm gently. "Another time, perhaps. Please tell Mary I asked after her." Mr. Greeley, a retired postal worker with perfectly trimmed hedges, was watering his immaculate emerald lawn when she approached, the rainbow mist from his sprinkler catching the sunlight. His khaki pants were creased to perfection, not a drop of water on his polished loafers. He didn't even wait for her to finish explaining about the quilting group. "Not our thing," he said bluntly, adjusting his sprinkler with precise movements. "Margaret and I prefer our quiet evenings with our mystery shows. Thanks anyway." He turned back to his lawn without another word, effectively dismissing her. Each refusal felt heavier than the last, pressing down on Eve's shoulders like physical weights. Her initial enthusiasm withered with every shaken head and apologetic smile. She found herself slumping onto a wooden bench in the town square, watching a group of teenagers horsing around near the white gazebo, their laughter carrying across the neatly trimmed grass. One boy, tall and lanky with a bright red baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, threw his head back laughing at something his friend said, his whole body radiating carefree joy. His uninhibited happiness felt like a stark reminder of her own isolation, the empty house waiting for her, the silence that had become her constant companion since Harold left this world. The afternoon sun was starting to slant between the maple trees, casting long, stretched shadows across the square and turning the windows of the courthouse to sheets of blazing gold. Eve checked her list. 2 more houses to go, but her feet felt leaden, her earlier courage seeping away with each step. Maybe a cup of coffee and a moment to gather her thoughts at Dottie's diner would help restore her spirits before she finished her rounds. She could sit at the counter, smell the comforting aroma of fresh pie, and remember why this mattered so much to her in the first place. Eve pushed open the diner door, welcoming the warmth and familiar scent of coffee and pie that wrapped around her like an old quilt. The bell chimed merrily above her head as she slipped onto a red vinyl stool at the counter, the cushion sighing beneath her weight. Linda, the waitress with laugh lines etched deeply around her eyes, immediately poured her a steaming cup of coffee without asking, the rich brown liquid swirling in the thick white mug. "Rough day?" Linda asked, noting Eve's tired expression and the slight droop in her normally straight shoulders. "Just making the rounds," Eve replied with a small smile, wrapping her hands around the warm mug gratefully. The heat seeped into her chilled fingers, a simple comfort after hours of walking door to door. "Thank you." 2 older women at the end of the counter, Martha Davidson with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and her friend Betty Miller in a floral cardigan, were speaking in hushed but urgent tones that carried despite their efforts. All the baked goods scattered everywhere. The pies were smashed right on the floor, and the cookies were crushed underfoot. Such a shame, right? Before the church fundraiser, too. "All that work ruined," Martha lamented, shaking her head. "I heard it was those bikers passing through," Betty replied, her thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "They were revving their motorcycles outside the Piggly Wiggly yesterday. Reverend Hale was right when he spoke about protecting our town values at last week's service. We can't let outsiders bring their trouble here." Eve sipped her coffee slowly, half listening as the conversation drifted around her like autumn leaves in a breeze. The diner was busy with the late afternoon crowd, locals stopping in for pie and gossip before heading home for dinner. The clatter of forks against plates and the gentle hum of conversation created a familiar soundtrack to Eve's thoughts. The bell above the door chimed again, bright and clear. The teen she'd seen in the square earlier walked in, his red baseball cap now turned backward, revealing a shock of dark hair and a forehead dotted with acne. His shoulders hunched slightly as he headed toward the counter to place a to-go order, clearly uncomfortable with the number of adults in the small space. Mrs. Davidson straightened up on her stool, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "That's him. I saw him hanging around the church last night when I was driving home from my bridge game. He was just lurking there in the shadows." The diner grew quieter, like a radio being turned down notch by notch. Eve watched as the boy's shoulders tensed further, feeling the weight of suspicious stares bearing down on him from all sides. His fingers fidgeted with the zipper of his worn jacket. "He was probably the one who did it," Mrs. Davidson continued, her voice carrying across the diner like a stone thrown in still water. "Always skateboarding around there with his friends, making noise and leaving trash. No respect, these kids today." Eve set down her coffee cup with a gentle clink against the saucer. "Did you actually see him do anything wrong, Martha?" she asked, her voice soft but clear enough to reach everyone's ears. The diner fell silent, the only sound the gentle hiss of the grill from the kitchen. Mrs. Davidson blinked, surprised at the gentle challenge from someone she considered quiet and agreeable. "Well, no, but," she stammered, her confident accusation faltering. "Then maybe we shouldn't accuse people without proof." Eve's voice was quiet but firm, like a hand steadying a wobbling table. "Especially our young people. They're still finding their way in this world." A man at a nearby booth, Fred Thompson in his usual plaid shirt and suspenders, muttered, "We need to protect our own." But Eve continued looking steadily at Mrs. Davidson, her gaze unwavering yet kind. "I was at the library until 9 last night," the teen spoke up, his voice slightly shaky but gaining strength with each word. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "Ms. Wilson was there. You can ask her. I was studying for my biology test. I even helped her shelve books before she closed up." Eve nodded, offering him a small smile of encouragement. "That seems pretty straightforward then, doesn't it?" she asked, looking around at the faces that now showed hints of embarrassment for their rush to judgment. The tension in the diner slowly dissipated like morning mist under sunshine as conversations resumed. The teen caught Eve's eye and gave her a small, grateful nod before taking his brown paper bag of food and leaving, the bell announcing his departure. Linda refilled Eve's coffee, adding just a splash more than usual. "That was kind of you," she said quietly, her voice warm with approval. "Not everyone would have spoken up." "It wasn't kindness," Eve replied, stirring a teaspoon of sugar into the fresh coffee. "It was just right. We're too quick sometimes to see the worst in people, especially those who are different from us." She finished her coffee, savoring the last sweet sip as she thought about the remaining 2 houses on her list. The afternoon light was growing golden outside the diner windows, painting the main street with a honeyed glow, but there was still time before dusk settled over the town. Despite the chilly reception she'd received so far at most doorsteps, she felt more determined than ever to extend her invitations. Sometimes, she reflected, running her thumb over a small chip in the mug's handle, the most important things were the hardest to do. Standing up, she smoothed her cardigan and left money on the counter for her coffee, including a generous tip. The worn leather of her purse felt familiar against her side as she headed toward the door. The autumn air felt crisp against her face as she stepped outside, the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke greeting her. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and headed down the sidewalk, ready to continue her rounds despite the growing chill in the air. Eve walked briskly down Cedar Street, her earlier determination still burning bright after the diner incident. The cool autumn air nipped at her cheeks as maple leaves crunched beneath her sensible shoes. Maggie Rowe's house appeared ahead, its cheerful yellow paint and well-tended flower boxes a familiar comfort against the backdrop of the darkening sky. Chrysanthemums in deep burgundy and gold nodded in the gentle breeze, as if welcoming her approach. Before Eve could knock, the door swung open with a creak of well-worn hinges. "I saw you coming up the walk," Maggie said, her gray hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, not a strand out of place. Laugh lines crinkled around her eyes as she smiled. "Get in here before you freeze. You're turning pink as my peonies in spring." The warmth of Maggie's kitchen enveloped Eve as she stepped inside, bringing with it the comforting scents of cinnamon and vanilla. The counter held cooling racks of banana bread, moisture still rising in fragrant wisps, and the kettle was already whistling its shrill welcome from the stovetop. Handmade Afghan draped over the back of a rocking chair in the corner, adding to the room's embrace. "I was hoping you'd stop by," Maggie said, pulling out a chair with a scrape against the linoleum floor. "Sit. You look like you've been on your feet all day. Those worry lines are showing again." Eve slipped off her cardigan and settled into the chair, feeling the familiar comfort of Maggie's presence wash over her. She explained her idea for the quilting and reading group, while Maggie poured steaming tea into mismatched mugs, one with faded roses, another with a chipped rim that somehow never cut lips. "I thought we could meet weekly, share stories while we work with our hands," Eve said, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. "Create something beautiful together. Maybe help some of the newer folks feel more welcome." When she finished, Maggie's face lit up like a Christmas tree, eyes twinkling with enthusiasm. "Count me in," she said immediately, setting her mug down with decisive firmness. "And I've got extra fabric from when I used to make the kids' clothes. Beautiful cottons and flannels just gathering dust in my sewing room. We could use that." She paused, studying Eve's face with the practiced assessment of a former nurse. "How many others have agreed so far?" Eve's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of multiple polite rejections settling there. "You're the first yes." Maggie reached across the table and squeezed her hand, her palm warm and slightly rough from years of practical work. "Their loss. We'll start small and grow. That's how the best things happen. Like sourdough starter, just needs a little time and care." After leaving Maggie's, her spirit somewhat lifted by her friend's enthusiasm, Eve made her final stop at the Hendersons' brick two-story with its immaculately trimmed hedges. Mrs. Henderson answered the door with a phone pressed to her ear, her perfectly highlighted hair bouncing as she nodded into the receiver. She gestured Eve to wait with one manicured finger while she finished her call, her expression shifting from annoyance to practiced politeness. "Sorry, but we're just too busy these days," Mrs. Henderson said after hearing Eve's proposal, not quite meeting her eyes. She ticked off on her fingers as she spoke. "Book club, church committee, Jason's soccer practice. You understand. Maybe another time?" Walking home in the fading light, Eve felt the day's mixed emotions settle around her like fallen leaves, disappointment and hope swirling together in an unpredictable pattern. The street lamps flickered to life one by one, casting pools of golden light on the sidewalk. One yes meant hope, she reminded herself. One yes was enough to start. Harold had always said that great journeys begin with a single step. Back home, Eve switched on the lamp in her modest living room and opened Harold's old dresser drawer, the wood smooth from years of use. She carefully arranged the last box of his belongings. Sterling silver cufflinks with his initials, old receipts he'd saved from their anniversary dinners, a half-used notebook of crossword puzzles with his neat handwriting in blue ink. Her fingers lingered on his favorite tie, the blue one with tiny sailboats that she'd given him for their 30th anniversary. The silk was still soft, still held the faintest trace of his aftershave. At her desk by the window, she wrote a short note in her neat librarian script. Quilting and reading group, starting Thursday at 2 p.m., all welcome. Tea provided. No experience necessary. She'd post it at the library tomorrow, perhaps add a few colorful borders to catch the eye. The rumble of a motorcycle in the distance made her pause, her pen hovering over the paper. Eve walked to the window, pushing aside the lace curtain Harold had always teased her about. She watched headlights appear and disappear on the far road that led to the highway, a mechanical growl echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The sound faded into the night, but left behind a slight unease that settled in her stomach like a stone. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Through the peephole, she recognized George Watson from church, his tall frame hunched slightly as he shifted nervously on her welcome mat, the one that said, "All are welcome here," in faded letters. "Sorry to bother you so late, Eve," he said when she opened the door, his voice lowered as though sharing a secret. "But I thought you should know. There was a meeting at the church this afternoon about the vandalism. Pastor called it special-like." Eve noticed how he kept glancing over his shoulder at the darkened street, his fingers fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. "What kind of meeting?" "Some folks are worried. There's talk about Hell's Angels being spotted near Miller's Creek. And with the bake sale mess," he cleared his throat, a raspy sound in the quiet night. "People are scared of outsiders causing trouble. Reverend Hale suggested neighborhood watches, lists of unfamiliar vehicles, that sort of thing." Eve thought of the teen at the diner, his worn jacket and tired eyes, how quickly suspicion had fallen on him simply for being unknown. "Was anything actually proven about the bake sale? Any evidence at all?" "No, but better safe than sorry, right?" George gave a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just wanted to keep you informed, you being alone here and all. Since Harold—" His voice trailed off awkwardly. After he left, Eve stood in her doorway for a moment, watching the streetlights cast their amber glow over the silent houses. The autumn air had grown colder, carrying the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys and the earthy smell of fallen leaves. She thought of Maggie's immediate yes, of the teen's grateful nod in the diner, of Harold's belongings finally settled in their drawer after months of her avoiding the task. One yes was enough to start. Sometimes that was all the universe offered, one door opening while others remained closed. She closed and locked her door as darkness settled completely over the street, but left the porch light burning bright, a small beacon in the growing darkness. The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Matthew's Church steps as Eve joined the small group of volunteers patching up the damaged bake sale stand. Mrs. Peterson dabbed wood glue on the splintered table legs, while Mr. Collins untangled the decorative ropes that had been torn down. The church's white steeple gleamed against the clear blue sky, standing tall as if keeping watch over their wounded community. "Such a shame," Mrs. Peterson muttered, smoothing her apron with weathered hands. 20 years we've had this stand. Never a problem until now. My grandmother's recipe cards were in that drawer they broke. Some of them can't be replaced." Eve knelt beside her, carefully gathering the scattered fragments of wood. "We'll make it stronger than before," she said softly, her fingers tracing the jagged edges where vandals had taken a crowbar to the once cheerful stand. Inside the church hall, metal chairs scraped against the floor as townspeople filed in for the emergency meeting. The usual friendly chatter was replaced by tense whispers and worried glances. Reverend Tom Hale stood at the podium, his round face creased with concern, fingers nervously adjusting his collar. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patches on the worn carpet. Spots of beauty at odds with the anxiety filling the room. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice warm and steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "I know we're all worried about recent events, but let's remember who we are as a community. We're Cedar Springs, people who look out for each other, who bring casseroles when someone's sick and shovel driveways when someone can't." Eve noticed the teen from yesterday, Danny Martinez, sitting with his mother in the back row. The boy hunched in his seat, trying to make himself smaller as his mother's hand rested protectively on his shoulder. They both looked uncomfortable as whispers rippled through the crowd, punctuated by sidelong glances in their direction. "My sister saw those bikers on Route 7, called out Fred Thompson from the hardware store, his normally jovial face hardened with suspicion. "3 of them, just watching the town. Leather jackets with some kind of symbol. And now this vandalism? Doesn't take a genius to connect the dots." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room like wildfire. The gentle community Eve knew seemed to be transforming before her eyes, fear creating divisions where none had existed before. Mrs. Wilson, who ran the flower shop, stood up shakily, her cane tapping the floor for balance. "And what about young Danny there? Sarah saw him hanging around before it happened. Said he was talking to one of those strangers near the park." Danny's mother gripped his arm tighter. The boy's face flushed red as heads turned toward him, some faces curious, others openly hostile. "That's not fair," Eve spoke up, her voice clear in the tense room. Her heart pounded, but she kept her tone even. "Danny helps me carry books at the library sometimes. He stayed 2 hours last week helping me sort donations. He's a good kid who volunteers when most teenagers wouldn't." Mrs. Wilson's lips tightened into a thin line. "Well, someone did it, and we need to protect ourselves. I say we form neighborhood watches, keep an eye on strangers, maybe check who's been hanging around with who." A man Eve hadn't noticed before stepped forward from near the door. He wore a police uniform that looked freshly pressed, and his calm presence drew attention like a magnet drawing scattered nails. His dark eyes were alert but kind, taking in every detail of the room. "I'm Officer Jaime Ortega," he said, his voice carrying without shouting. "I was assigned here last month from the county office. We're investigating the vandalism thoroughly, but jumping to conclusions won't help anyone. Let's stick to facts, not speculation or rumors that might hurt innocent people." "The fact is, we never had trouble before those bikers showed up," someone called out from the middle rows. "My cousin in Oak Ridge says they've had problems with gangs, drugs and such." Reverend Hale raised his hands, palms out in a placating gesture. "Please, everyone. Officer Ortega is right. We need patience and understanding. Our strength lies in coming together, not tearing apart. The Good Samaritan didn't ask which tribe the injured man belonged to. He simply helped." Eve watched Officer Ortega jot notes in a small notebook, his expression thoughtful as he studied the crowd. His gaze seemed to linger on those speaking most loudly, then drift to those sitting quietly. He caught her eye and gave a slight nod of appreciation for her earlier defense of Danny. "Mrs. Wilson," Eve said gently, standing again. The wooden pew creaked beneath her as she rose. "Remember last summer when we thought raccoons were destroying your garden? Those beautiful dahlias you'd worked so hard on? And it turned out to be Mr. Peter's new puppy digging for bones? Sometimes things aren't what they seem at first glance. We were ready to call animal control before we knew the truth." Mrs. Wilson's shoulders relaxed slightly, her grip loosening on her cane. "Well, yes, that's true enough. I did feel foolish afterward." But before the moment could settle, a shout came from outside. The crowd surged toward the windows, then spilled out into the square like water breaking through a dam. Eve heard fragments of excited voices. "Saw them again. 3 motorcycles. Headed this way." The fear in their voices was palpable, electric. She stayed behind as the others rushed out, noticing how Danny and his mother slipped quietly away through a side door, heads down. Officer Ortega remained too, flipping through, his notebook with a slight frown creasing his forehead. "Thank you," he said to Eve when they were almost alone in the hall, "for speaking up. Not everyone would have the courage, especially when emotions are running high." "It needed to be said," Eve replied simply, gathering her cardigan closer. "Fear makes us forget who we really are." Walking home alone, Eve felt drained by the morning's tensions. The maple trees along her street were losing their leaves early this year, scattering red and gold across her path like nature's confetti. A chilly breeze whispered through the branches, carrying the scent of wood smoke and approaching fall. She thought about Danny's face when he was accused, the shame and hurt in his young eyes, about the fear she'd seen transforming the church hall from sanctuary to courtroom, about how quickly people could turn against their own neighbors. The weight of it settled in her chest like a stone. But she also thought about Officer Ortega's steady presence, about Mrs. Wilson's moment of reflection, about the volunteers quietly repairing the bake sale stand instead of just complaining about it. Mr. Collins had even added a fresh coat of paint to cover the ugly graffiti. There was still good here, still hope beneath the surface of fear. She just had to keep reminding people of that, one gentle word at a time. As she rounded the corner to her street, she resolved to bake an extra loaf of banana bread, one for Danny and his mother, to remind them they weren't alone. The afternoon sky had opened up, turning Main Street into a glistening river of reflected storefronts. Eve pulled her cardigan tighter, hurrying past the hardware store as fat raindrops drummed against the awnings. Her sensible shoes splashed through puddles that had formed between the old cobblestones, each step sending up tiny sprays of water that dampened the hem of her skirt. The rain had started suddenly, catching everyone by surprise, transforming the normally bustling street into a deserted watercolor painting where only the desperate or determined ventured out. She heard them before she saw them. Teenage voices sharp with meanness, cutting through the steady patter of rain. A group of 4 boys, maybe 15 or 16 years old, lounged under the shelter of the pharmacy's overhang. One of them pointed at her, nudging his friends with an elbow and a smirk. They wore matching Letterman jackets from the local high school, their young faces twisted with the particular cruelty that comes from pack mentality. "Hey, look who it is! The biker lover!" The tallest boy's voice cracked with false bravado, his words echoing off the wet storefront windows. Eve's cheeks burned hot despite the chill of the rain. She kept walking, eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to hear, clutching her damp canvas bag closer to her body. The library books inside would be getting wet if she didn't find shelter soon. But they peeled away from the wall, falling into step behind, her, their sneakers slapping against the wet pavement. "What's wrong, Mrs. Mercer? Too good to talk to us now that you're hanging out with criminals?" The second boy had freckles across his nose, Billy Henderson's son. She'd helped him with his science fair project just last year. "I heard she's helping them scout places to rob," another voice chimed in. "My dad says those bikers are casing the whole town, and she's showing them where to start." The words stung worse than the rain. These were kids she knew, children who'd once checked out books from her library, who had sat cross-legged during story time, whose mothers she saw at the grocery store and church potlucks, children who'd once looked up at her with respect. Now they circled her like wolves, emboldened by rumors and rain, the anonymity of the empty street giving them courage. "I don't know what you've heard," Eve said quietly, her voice nearly lost in the downpour. "But—" A glob of spit landed on her sleeve, a shocking white blob against the blue wool. Eve flinched, her throat tight with humiliation as laughter erupted behind her. Water dripped from her hair, running down her neck and beneath her collar. The small gold cross she always wore felt suddenly cold against her skin. The low rumble of a motorcycle engine cut through the rain, the distinctive growl growing louder as it approached. 2 bikes pulled up to the curb, their riders cutting imposing figures against the gray afternoon. Water beaded on black leather and chrome. The teenagers fell silent as the larger of the 2 men dismounted, his boots hitting the wet pavement with purpose. He moved with the easy confidence of someone used to commanding attention, shoulders squared beneath a worn leather vest adorned with patches. Tattoos wound up his forearms, disappearing under rolled sleeves, intricate designs that spoke of a life lived on different terms than the neat houses of Mapleton. A scar traced his left cheekbone like a pale lightning bolt, a testament to some long-ago violence. But it was his eyes that caught Eve off guard. Warm brown, watchful, gentler than she'd expected, crinkling slightly at the corners as he assessed the situation. Without a word, he shrugged off his leather jacket and draped it over her shoulders in a gesture of unexpected gentleness. The leather was warm from his body, heavy and surprisingly soft against her rain-chilled skin. It smelled of tobacco and motor oil, of open roads, and a life she'd never known. "Everything all right here?" His voice was deep, quiet, the kind of quiet that made people lean in to listen. There was no threat in the words, but something in his stance made the teenagers take an instinctive step backward. Before Eve could answer, he turned to address the gathered onlookers who had stopped to stare. A few curious shopkeepers had ventured to their doorways, and a couple with an umbrella watched from across the street. "This woman's my wife now," he announced, each word, clear and measured, ringing with authority. "Anyone gives her trouble, they answer to me. Name's Cass Donovan." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain on metal awnings. Eve's mouth fell open in surprise, but she caught herself quickly, pressing her lips together. The teenagers had backed away toward the pharmacy entrance, their earlier bravado evaporating like puddles in summer sun. Down the street, curtains twitched as curious faces peered out at the scene, the town's rumor mill already beginning to spin. Cass turned back to Eve, his expression softening slightly. Weather-lined creases around his eyes relaxed, and he leaned in so only she could hear his next words. "You're soaked through, ma'am. Let me give you a ride to somewhere dry." He gestured to his bike, the leather seat glistening with rain, then added more quietly, "The clubhouse isn't far. You'll be safe there until this weather clears. Got coffee and heat." Eve stood frozen, water dripping from her hair onto her shoulders, trying to process the sudden turn of events. The leather jacket was warm around her shoulders, enveloping her in its protection, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. Her house was still 6 blocks away. She looked at Cass, at the gentle eyes that seemed at odds with his intimidating presence, and saw nothing but genuine concern beneath the gruff exterior. The teenagers had scattered, leaving only whispers in their wake. Already, Eve could imagine the news spreading through town like wildfire. Quiet widow Eve Mercer, spotted with the leader of the Hells Angels, accepting his jacket, perhaps even his unlikely claim. Harold had been gone 3 years now, and never once had she given the town anything to gossip about. But in that moment, standing in the rain with her clothes soaked through and the sting of humiliation still fresh, with this unexpected defender appearing like some rough-edged guardian angel, she found herself nodding at his offer. The ride to the clubhouse was brief but memorable. Eve had never been on a motorcycle before, and she found herself holding tight to Cass's broad back as they wound through side streets slick with rain. When they pulled up to a weathered 2-story building on the edge of town, warm light spilled from its windows onto the wet pavement. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of coffee and motor oil, undercut by leather and tobacco. A television mumbled sports commentary from one corner, while several men lounged on mismatched furniture. What caught Eve's eye, though, were the quilts, 3 or 4 of them draped over an old couch, their patterns intricate and clearly well-loved. "This here's Patch," Cass said, gesturing to a man with salt and pepper hair who was rising from a long wooden table. "He's my right hand." Patch's handshake was firm but gentle. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes kind beneath a weathered face. Let me get you some coffee. You must be frozen through." Other club members introduced themselves with quiet nods. Bear, a giant of a man with surprisingly delicate reading glasses perched on his nose. Tommy, who couldn't be more than 25 and had a smartphone in his hand. And Doc, whose gray beard couldn't hide his gentle smile. "Sit," Patch insisted, pulling out a chair at the table. He set down a steaming mug and pushed a bowl of store-bought biscuits her way. "Sugar's there if you need it." Eve wrapped her cold hands around the mug, still wearing Cass's jacket. The silence felt thick, but not hostile. More uncertain, like everyone was trying to figure out what came next. "About what I said in town," Cass began, settling into the chair across from her. His voice was low, meant mainly for her ears. "Had to stop those boys somehow. But now that it's said, it means something to us. To them out there, too." "I don't understand," Eve said quietly. Patch cleared his throat. "It's about protection, Mrs. Mercer. Once the boss claims someone as family, even by marriage, there's a code. Nobody touches them." "But we're not actually," Eve started. "Doesn't matter," Cass interrupted gently. "Word's out now. You've been targeted once. Won't let it happen again." Eve stared into her coffee, processing this. The rain drummed steadily outside, and somewhere in the building, a clock ticked. The television droned on about baseball scores. "Stay tonight," Cass said. It wasn't quite a question, but his tone left room for refusal. "Weather's bad. We've got a spare room upstairs, clean sheets. Patch's wife left some clothes here you can borrow." Eve looked around the room. Bear had returned to his book. She could now see it was a well-worn copy of John Steinbeck. Tommy was showing Doc something on his phone, both of them chuckling quietly. It felt normal. Safe, even. "All right," she found herself saying. "Thank you." The spare room was small but neat, with a narrow cot and a window that looked out over rain-slicked streets. Someone, probably Patch, had found her a pair of sweatpants and a soft t-shirt to sleep in. Eve changed gratefully out of her wet clothes, hanging them carefully over a chair to dry. Through the walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of the clubhouse settling for the night. Quiet conversations, the occasional laugh, the steady hum of motorcycles passing on the street outside. It was different from the silence of her empty house, somehow less lonely. When she opened the door to return Cass's jacket, she found him sitting in a chair outside her room, arms crossed. "You don't have to," she began. "I do," he said simply. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Mercer." Eve nodded, understanding that arguing would be pointless. She retreated to her cot, pulling up the clean-smelling blanket. The last thing she saw before drifting off was Cass's silhouette in the doorway, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. Through the pre-dawn gloom, Cass moved quietly through the clubhouse kitchen. His boots, usually heavy, on the wooden floors, made little sound as he measured coffee grounds into the industrial-sized maker. The familiar ritual, one he'd performed thousands of times, felt different this morning, knowing Eve slept upstairs. He paused, letting his calloused hands rest on the counter. 20 years ago, those same hands had put a man in the hospital. 30 years ago, they'd gripped handlebars as he ran from the law. Now they measured coffee and kept watch over a librarian who spoke up when others wouldn't. The coffee maker gurgled to life, just as soft footsteps descended the stairs. Eve appeared, wearing yesterday's clothes but looking remarkably composed. She carried a paperback she must have found on one of the clubhouse shelves. "Morning," Cass said, his voice rougher than he intended. Eve nodded, settling at the kitchen table. "Good morning." She opened the book, some well-worn romance novel, but her eyes didn't move across the pages. Cass poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one before her without asking. He noticed how she curled her fingers around the warmth, just like last night. "About what I said yesterday," he began. "Yes," Eve said quietly. "I've been thinking about that." Cass sat across from her, his large frame making the kitchen chair creak. "Wasn't planned, but seeing those kids circling you like that..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening at the memory. "Why me?" Eve asked directly, meeting his eyes. "You don't know me." "Know enough," he replied. "Saw you defend that Martinez kid at the diner. Not many would have done that." Eve's phone buzzed on the table, making them both start. Maggie's name lit up the screen. "You should answer," Cass said, standing. "I'll give you privacy." Eve picked up the phone as Cass moved to the counter, pretending to busy himself with the coffee maker, but unable to help overhearing. "Evelyn Marie Mercer," Maggie's voice carried clearly through the speaker. "Is it true? Mrs. Henderson called me at 6 this morning saying you're married to a Hell's Angel?" "Maggie, it's not," Eve began. "Because if it is true, you could have at least invited me to the wedding," Maggie continued, her tone shifting from scandalized to amused. "Though I suppose it was rather sudden." "It's complicated," Eve said, glancing at Cass's back. "Well, complicated or not, you're safe. He's treating you right?" "Yes," Eve said softly. "I'm safe." There was a pause on the line. "Then that's what matters. Come see me when you can. I want details." After Eve hung up, silence settled back over the kitchen. Cass turned, leaning against the counter. "Town's talking," he said unnecessarily. "They always do." Eve closed her book. "What happens now?" Cass considered her question carefully. "You stay here long as you need. Help out if you want. Patch's wife usually handles the cooking, but she's visiting her sister in Oregon." "I can cook," Eve offered. "It's the least I can do." "Don't owe us anything." "I know." Eve stood, straightening her sweater. "But I'd like to help anyway." Cass watched as she began examining the kitchen cabinets, taking stock of supplies with quiet efficiency. Something in his chest tightened, a feeling he'd spent decades avoiding. Attachments were dangerous in his world. They gave enemies leverage, created weak spots in carefully constructed armor. But watching Eve move through his kitchen, making notes on a scrap of paper about groceries needed, Cass realized it might already be too late for caution. He'd claimed her publicly, and not just because of club code or protection. Something about her quiet strength, her willingness to stand alone for what was right, had called to something in him he thought long buried. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the kitchen windows. Outside, the first rumble of motorcycles signaled the club members arriving for breakfast. Eve rolled up her sleeves, found an apron hanging by the stove, and began pulling out pans with calm purpose. "There's pancake mix in that cabinet," Cass said, moving to help her reach it. Their hands brushed briefly, and neither pulled away too quickly. Over the next 3 days, Eve splits her time between the clubhouse and her house, helping where needed and returning home each night. The routine develops naturally, like water finding its path downstream. That first morning, Eve discovers a mountain of unwashed club t-shirts and riding gear. Without comment, she sorts colors from whites, starting loads in the ancient washing machine. Patch's wife usually handles these tasks, and the men shuffle awkwardly around Eve's quiet efficiency. "You don't have to," Cass says, watching her fold. "I know." Eve smooths a crease. "But idle hands make poor company." By evening, fresh laundry fills the air with clean cotton scents. Eve heads home, and Cass insists on following her motorcycle with his own until she's safely inside. Dawn brings Eve back with grocery bags and determination. She teaches Cass how to brew proper tea. Let it steep, don't rush it, while mixing biscuit dough. His large hands look strange, holding the delicate teacup, but he drinks it without complaint. The clubhouse fills with stories over lunch. Patch talks about his first motorcycle, a beat-up Harley held together with hope and baling wire. Others share tales of cross-country rides and brotherhood. Eve listens, seeing past their gruff exteriors to the loyalty beneath. That afternoon, everything changes. The Valley Register's headline screams, "Violent Past, Local Motorcycle Club Leader's Criminal Record Revealed." The article details Cass's 20-year-old conviction for aggravated assault, painting him as a dangerous thug. The editorial suggests the town take action before tragedy strikes. Eve reads it at her kitchen table, hands trembling slightly. When she walks to the market later, mothers pull their children closer. Teenagers whisper, "Biker's woman," behind cupped hands. Morning finds Eve and Cass in the Hawa clubhouse kitchen, the newspaper between them like a wall. "I should have told you," he says, voice rough. "Yes," Eve agrees. "You should have." "I was 28. Some guys were roughing up my friend's sister. I went too far stopping them." Cass stares into his coffee. "Did time, learned control? But that anger, protecting people who can't protect themselves, it's still there." Eve studies his face, the weathered lines, the scar, the gentle way he holds his cup despite everything. "The man in that article, is he who you are now?" "No." Cass meets her gaze. "But some people won't see past it." Eve nods slowly. "Then we show them something different." She pulls out paper, starts writing. "The church still needs money to replace that vandalized stand. What if the club helped sponsor a fundraiser? Town won't want our help." "Maybe not at first." Eve keeps writing. But healing has to start somewhere. By evening, she has a plan. A community dinner, motorcycle rides for donations, quilts for auction. Simple things to bridge the gap between two worlds. When Cass walks her to her bike that night, there's a new weight between them. Not just his past, but their shared present. The newspaper's accusations hang in the air, but Eve's determination shines brighter. "You still trust me?" Cass asks gruffly. "After reading that?" Eve pauses, keys in hand. "I trust who you are now," she says. "The rest is just history." The streetlights flicker on as Eve rides home, Cass following as always. Tomorrow will bring more whispers, more judgment. But tonight, she focuses on planning a fundraiser that might help two divided groups remember their common humanity. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Perfect weather for the fundraiser. Eve arrived at the clubhouse at 6 o'clock sharp, her car trunk filled with tablecloths, paint supplies, and 3 dozen fresh muffins. Patch was already there, setting up folding tables in the parking lot. "Morning, Eve," he called, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Got half the guys up and moving. The rest are coming around slow as molasses." By 7, the lot hummed with activity. Maggie brought her famous lemon squares, and Mrs. Powell, who had declined the quilting group, showed up with her grandchildren and an apologetic smile. The kids immediately began stringing colorful paper chains between posts. "Never thought I'd see the day," Patch muttered, watching bikers and townspeople working side by side. A group of leather-clad club members carefully painted the repaired bake sale stand in cheerful yellow, while church ladies arranged cookies nearby. The local radio host, Jenny Martinez, arrived with her microphone and portable equipment. "This is something special," she said, interviewing Eve. "A town coming together, breaking down walls. Our listeners will love this story." Eve noticed Reverend Hale standing across the street, hands clasped behind his back. His expression shifted between concern and curiosity as he watched children high-fiving bikers and elderly women teaching club members the proper way to frost cupcakes. By mid-morning, the fundraiser was in full swing. Motorcycles gleamed in the sun as club members offered rides around the block for $5 each. A line of excited kids and adventurous grandmothers formed, their laughter carrying across the lot. The bake sale table, now repainted and sturdy, overflowed with homemade treats. Someone had strung fairy lights around its edges, twinkling even in daylight. Eve touched the smooth wood, remembering how it had once symbolized division. Now it brought people together over sugar cookies and coffee cake. At noon, Eve found herself on the clubhouse porch with Cass, both taking a brief break from the festivities. They sat in comfortable chairs, watching the crowd below. "You did this," Cass said quietly. "Brought them all together." Eve shook her head. "We all did it. People just needed a chance to see past their fears. Some of us give them good reason to be afraid." Cass's voice held old pain. "That article wasn't wrong about what I did. But it wasn't the whole truth either." Eve turned toward him. "Family isn't just blood. It's who we choose to become, who we protect, how we grow. You've built something good here, Cass." Their hands rested inches apart on the armrests. Eve felt the space between them, charged with unspoken words. Cass's fingers twitched slightly, but neither closed the gap. "Sometimes I think about starting fresh," he admitted. "Somewhere nobody knows my past." "And leave all this?" Eve gestured to the scene below, where Patch was teaching Mrs. Powell's youngest grandchild how to make paper airplanes. A small smile touched Cass's lips. "No. Guess I found my family right here." The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. The fundraiser exceeded all expectations, raising enough to repair the bake sale stand 3 times over. More importantly, something shifted in the town's atmosphere. People who had avoided eye contact for weeks now shared plates of brownies and swapped stories. As the sun began to set, Eve watched Mrs. Miller, who had declined her quilting invitation, hugging one of the club members' wives. Nearby, Reverend Hale had finally crossed the street and was deep in conversation with Patch about motorcycle maintenance. The cleanup effort felt like a continuation of the celebration. Everyone pitched in, folding tables and storing leftover baked goods with the same cheerful energy that had marked the entire day. Children darted between adults, still flying paper airplanes in the golden evening light. Eve stood by the freshly painted bake sale stand, now ready to return to its place at the church. Its yellow surface glowed in the setting sun, no longer a symbol of vandalism and fear, but of a community's capacity to heal. The Saturday evening sky had barely settled into dusk when the first shouts pierced the quiet. Eve, who had been gathering the last of the paper chains with Maggie, looked up to see an orange glow reflecting off the church windows. "Fire!" someone yelled from the direction of the bake sale stand. "Someone call 911!" The smell hit her next, acrid smoke with an oddly chemical edge that made her eyes water. Eve ran toward the commotion, her heart pounding. The beautiful yellow stand they'd just repainted hours ago was now engulfed in flames. Patch was already there, throwing dirt on the base of the fire. "Get back!" he shouted, pulling at a burning board with his bare hands. A sharp crack, and the board came loose, but not before Patch let out a pained grunt. His palm was angry red where splinters had caught him. Eve watched in horror as their day's work literally went up in smoke. Officer Ortega arrived with the fire department close behind, their sirens cutting through the evening quiet. As firefighters worked to extinguish the flames, a small crowd gathered. "I saw someone running that way." Mrs. Powell's grandson pointed towards the alley. "Just a shadow, but they were fast." The fire was out within minutes, leaving behind a blackened skeleton of wood and the thick stench of smoke. Officer Ortega moved methodically around the scene, his flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness. He paused, bending to pick something up. "Look at this," he said, holding up a coffee cup. The distinctive green logo from the Bean Counter Cafe was still visible, though smudged with soot. Eve's stomach dropped. She knew that cafe was where Rico, one of the club members, spent most mornings. Ortega continued his search, calling another officer over when he found something else. "Thread caught on this nail," he said, carefully removing a short length of black fiber. "Looks like it could be from a leather jacket." The whispers started immediately. Eve saw Reverend Hale approaching with the mayor, their faces grim in the emergency lights. "This is exactly what we feared," the mayor announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "First vandalism, now arson. The evidence points to these outsiders we foolishly welcomed today." "We need a full investigation," Reverend Hale added. "And in the meantime, I think it's best if the motorcycle club leaves town before things escalate further." Eve stepped forward. "You can't jump to conclusions. That cup could belong to anyone. Dozens of people go to the Bean Counter." But the damage was done. The crowd's mood had shifted from shock to anger. Eve watched helplessly as the day's progress crumbled like the charred remains of the stand. "Get out of our town!" someone shouted. Others joined in, their voices growing louder. Cass stood at the edge of the scene, his face unreadable in the flickering emergency lights. Eve had never seen him so still, so quiet. When their eyes met, she saw something that looked like resignation in his expression. Patch, his hand now wrapped in gauze by a paramedic, moved to stand beside his leader. "Cass," he said, quietly, "what do you want us to do?" But Cass remained silent, watching as the crowd grew more hostile. The mayor was already on his phone, likely calling for additional police presence. Church members who had shared cookies with club members just hours ago now stood with their arms crossed, faces hard with renewed suspicion. Eve felt tears stinging her eyes. Just that afternoon, they'd all been laughing together, building something beautiful. Now the night air crackled with accusations and fear. The acrid smoke, a bitter reminder of how quickly trust could burn. Sunday morning arrived with the harsh flash of police lights cutting through the dawn. Eve watched from her porch as 3 patrol cars pulled up to the clubhouse, their red and blue strobes painting the quiet street in alternating colors. Officer Ortega stepped out first, followed by 2 other officers. His face was drawn, professional but strained. The mayor stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching with grim satisfaction. "Rico Martinez," Ortega called out as he approached the clubhouse door. "We need you to come with us." Rico emerged, confusion written across his face. He was still wearing sleep clothes, sweatpants and a faded t-shirt that made him look younger, more vulnerable than his usual leather-clad self. "What's going on?" Rico asked, his voice rough with sleep. "We're bringing you in for questioning regarding last night's arson," Ortega explained, already reaching for his handcuffs. "Evidence places you at the scene." "What evidence? I wasn't anywhere near there after the fundraiser." But the cuffs were already clicking shut. Eve hurried across the street, her heart pounding. Other club members were emerging now, their faces dark with concern. "This is wrong," Eve said, reaching Ortega. "You know it's wrong." The mayor stepped forward. "The council expects action, Ms. Mercer. We have a coffee cup from his regular cafe and Fiber's matching motorcycle gear. Sometimes the simple answer is the correct one." Rico was being led to a patrol car, his stunned disbelief giving way to anger. "Cass, they can't do this." Cass appeared in the doorway, his jaw tight. He looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes from the night spent helping clean up after the fire. Eve saw how his hands clenched at his sides, but he remained controlled. "We'll get you out, brother," Cass said firmly. "Stay calm." After the patrol cars pulled away, Eve drove straight to the station. She found Ortega at his desk, reviewing paperwork with a troubled expression. "Jamie," she said quietly, using his first name. "Can we talk?" He glanced around before leading her to an empty interview room. Once the door closed, his professional mask slipped slightly. "This isn't right," Eve began. "Rico was helping all day at the fundraiser. You saw him yourself." Ortega ran a hand through his hair. "The mayor and council are breathing down my neck. They want someone in custody before this escalates further." He lowered his voice. "Look, I don't like it either, but without hard evidence pointing elsewhere, my hands are tied." "So you'll let an innocent man take the fall?" "Find me proof," Ortega said simply. "Bring me something concrete that shows it wasn't him. I'll act on real evidence, not just gut feelings." Eve left the station and drove straight to the jail's visiting area. Cass was already there, waiting to check on Rico. When he saw her, something in his expression softened slightly. "How is he?" Eve asked. "Angry, scared." Cass's voice was rough. "Brings back memories." Eve studied his face, the tight lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried an old weight. She could see his past conviction haunting him anew in every gesture. "They're doing to him what they did to you," she said softly. Cass nodded once, sharp and pained. "System sees what it wants to see. Doesn't matter if you're trying to do better, be better. One look at the leather, the tattoos." He trailed off, his hands clenched on the visiting room table. Eve reached across but stopped short of touching him. "I'm going to look into this myself," she said firmly. "Someone set that fire to hurt all of us, the club, the town, everything we built yesterday. I won't let them succeed." "It's dangerous," Cass warned, but she could see a glimmer of hope behind his concern. "So is letting fear tear us apart," Eve replied. She stood, gathering her resolve around her like armor. "I'm starting at the bean counter. Someone had to have seen something." Over the next 48 hours, Eve quietly followed small leads. She started at the Bean Counter Cafe, where morning regulars nursed their drinks and shared worried whispers about the arrest. "That coffee cup they found?" the barista, Jenny, said, while wiping down the counter. "We sell hundreds of those. Half the town gets their coffee here." She paused, frowning. "Though that particular brand sticker, we switched suppliers last month. Those old cups were cleared out weeks ago." Eve made notes in a small notebook she'd started carrying. Outside, the October wind scattered leaves across empty sidewalks. The town felt subdued, wrapped in suspicion. At the radio station, DJ Mike Thompson recalled the fundraiser broadcast. "Beautiful day," he said, adjusting his headphones. "Real shame about after. Though." He hesitated. "I did see Councilman Peters having words with someone by the square. Pretty heated, from what I could tell. Something about traditional values and profit margins." Eve's next stop was Town Hall. Sarah, a young aide, spoke in hushed tones by the water cooler. "The emergency council meeting that night was tense," she confided. "Some members were really upset about the motorcycle club getting involved in town events." Back at the bake sale stand, Eve knelt to examine the charred remains. Something caught her eye, a dark smear on the step she'd personally cleaned during the fundraiser. She recognized the distinctive smell of premium coffee, the expensive kind sold at the upscale cafe across town. "Found something interesting?" Maggie's voice made her jump. Her friend stood watching, arms crossed against the autumn chill. That evening, Eve spread her findings across Maggie's kitchen table. Patch joined them, bringing grainy security footage from a friend at the gas station. "Look here," Patch said, pointing to his laptop screen. The timestamp showed 9:47 p.m., less than an hour before the fire. A hooded figure moved through the frame, heading toward the square. That jacket. Notice anything?" Eve leaned closer. The hood had a distinctive cut, with brass toggles catching the streetlight. "That's the same style coat Councilman Peters wears," she said slowly. "And I found this caught on a nail." She held up a small bag containing a thread. Dark blue wool, expensive. "Matches his coat exactly," Maggie confirmed. "I've mended enough of the council's clothes at the alteration shop to know." They worked by candlelight, piecing together a timeline. The coffee brand, the coat, the angry words about tradition and profit. It painted a troubling picture of someone trying to frame the motorcycle club. "The cup was planted," Patch said grimly. "Someone's playing a dangerous game." Eve thought of Rico in his cell, of Cass's pained expression. "We need more proof," she said. "Something concrete enough for Officer Ortega to act on." Maggie refilled their teacups. "The question is, who stands to gain from keeping the town divided?" Through the window, Eve watched motorcycles pass, club members patrolling, keeping watch over their own. The candle flames cast dancing shadows as they continued working, determined to uncover the truth before more damage could be done. The wall clock ticked past midnight. They had evidence pointing to town officials rather than the club. But would it be enough? Eve gathered her notes, knowing tomorrow would bring more questions, more careful investigation. For now, though, they had hope, and sometimes that was enough to keep going. Eve's heart raced as she spread the evidence across Officer Ortega's desk. The morning light streaming through his office window illuminated each carefully collected item. "Look at this receipt," Eve said, pointing to the crumpled paper she'd retrieved from Councilman Peters' office trash. "Time-stamped 8:45 p.m., the night of the fire. Premium coffee from the Highland Cafe, the same brand I found smeared on the steps." Officer Ortega picked up the receipt with gloved hands, examining it carefully. "And the thread?" "The lab results just came back." Eve handed him the report. "Perfect match to the wool fiber from Mayor Williams's aide's jacket. Same dye lot, same manufacturer." Ortega leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This is serious evidence, Mrs. Mercer, but accusing council members. Please." Eve pushed forward the gas station footage. "Watch it again. That's clearly Thomas Peters' jacket, the brass toggles, the distinctive cut. And look at the timestamp." The footage played silently on Ortega's computer. The hooded figure moved with purpose, checking over their shoulder before disappearing toward the square. "All right," Ortega said finally. "I'll reopen the inquiry. The council meeting tonight would be the right time to present this." Just then, his radio crackled. "Disturbance at Miller's feed store. Possible assault." Eve's stomach dropped as she heard the details through the static. Cass Donovan, detained after a scuffle. She rushed to the store, finding a crowd gathered outside. The scene was chaos. Overturned feed bags, scattered grain. Witnesses described how it started. Cass had been helping unload supplies, a simple act of community service. Then George Warner, a local troublemaker, started in with taunts about those bikers ruining our town. "He just snapped," Mrs. Miller explained, wringing her hands. "Mr. Warner wouldn't stop, kept pushing and pushing. When he mentioned Cass's past conviction." Eve watched helplessly as they led Cass to the patrol car, his hands cuffed behind his back. His eyes met hers briefly, filled with shame and resignation. Back at the station, Eve pleaded with Officer Ortega. "Please, keep him here in County Holding, just until tonight's meeting. Once we present the evidence about the fire—" "Eve," Ortega said gently, "this is a separate incident." "But it's all connected." Her voice cracked. "The pressure they're putting on the club, the accusations, it's pushing good people to their breaking point. Just give me until the meeting. Please." Ortega studied her for a long moment. "I'll hold him here for 24 hours. But Eve, this needs to end tonight, one way or another. Eve nodded, gathering her evidence files. The council meeting was in 3 hours. 3 hours to prepare her case, to find the courage to stand up to the town's leadership. 3 hours to save not just Cass, but the fragile peace they'd started to build. She stopped by the holding cell before leaving. Cass sat on the narrow bunk, his shoulders slumped. "I messed up," he said quietly. "Lost my temper, just like they expected." "We're going to fix this," Eve promised. "All of it, just hold on a little longer." He looked up at her, his eyes tired but trusting. "Be careful, Eve. Some people don't want the truth coming out." She touched the cell bars lightly, then turned to go. The afternoon sun was sinking toward evening, casting long shadows across the station floor. In her bag, the evidence felt heavy, a weight of responsibility, of truth waiting to be revealed. The town hall clock struck 5. In 2 hours, the council chambers would fill. In 2 hours, everything would change. The town hall buzzed with tension as people filed in, metal chairs scraping against the wooden floor. Eve clutched her folder of evidence, watching faces both familiar and hostile turn toward her. The smell of cheap coffee from the back table mingled with rain-dampened wool coats. Mayor Williams called the meeting to order, his gavel sharp against the podium. "We're here to discuss recent criminal activities and community safety measures." "If I may," Eve interrupted, standing. Her voice wavered slightly but grew stronger. "I have evidence regarding the bake sale fire that needs to be heard." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Reverend Hale shifted in his front row seat, frowning. "The police have already made an arrest," Councilman Peters said dismissively. "Based on false assumptions." Eve moved to the center aisle, holding up the lab report. "This thread, found at the scene, matches exactly to the wool coat worn by David Morris, the mayor's assistant. Not just similar, identical dye lot and manufacturer." She projected the gas station footage onto the wall. "This security camera shows someone in a distinctive toggle coat, the same coat Mr. Peters wears, approaching the square minutes before the fire started." The crowd leaned forward, studying the grainy images. Peters' face reddened. "And this receipt." Eve held it high. "From the Highland Cafe, time-stamped just before the fire. The same premium coffee brand found spilled at the scene. Purchased by you, Mr. Peters." Officer Ortega stepped forward. "We've verified all this evidence. Additionally, witnesses have come forward about conversations they overheard regarding vendor contracts being threatened by the bake sale's success." Reverend Hale stood slowly. "What are you suggesting?" "That certain council members staged the arson to discredit the motorcycle club," Eve said clearly. "They blamed innocent people to protect their business interests." The room erupted. Mayor Williams banged his gavel frantically, but Officer Ortega raised his voice above the chaos. "Based on this evidence, I'm recommending charges against Councilman Peters, David Morris, and others involved in planning this crime. The current charges against the motorcycle club member will be dropped immediately." Reverend Hale sank back into his chair, face ashen. "Dear Lord," he whispered, "what have we allowed?" 2 officers moved to detain Peters and Morris. The mayor's protests died as Ortega produced warrant papers. As the crowd dispersed into the rainy night, shame and shock heavy in the air, Eve waited by her car. Minutes later, Cass emerged from the police station, paperwork completed for his release. He walked slowly to where she stood, hands in his pockets. "Heard what you did in there," he said quietly. "I couldn't let them blame innocent people," Eve replied. "Not when I knew the truth. Most folks wouldn't have bothered." His voice was rough with emotion. "Would have been easier to stay quiet." "Easier isn't always right." Eve looked up at him. I learned that from you." Cass reached out, touched her hand briefly. "You're braver than I ever was. I just throw punches. You changed minds tonight." "We all have our ways of standing up for what's right," Eve said softly. They stood there in the parking lot, rain misting around them, understanding passing between them without words. No dramatic gestures needed, just two people who'd found unexpected strength in each other, facing whatever tomorrow might bring. The town hall clock struck 11, its chimes echoing across the empty square. Inside, Officer Ortega was still processing paperwork, justice slowly grinding forward. But out here, in the gentle rain, something had shifted, not just between Eve and Cass, but in the very fabric of the town itself. 3 months later, frost touched the edges of autumn leaves in the town square. The morning sun caught glimpses of dew on the newly planted rose bush beside the clubhouse porch, its tender shoots protected by a careful lattice Cass had built. Inside, the hum of conversation and clicking needles filled the air as the Wednesday quilting circle gathered around the long table. Mrs. Powell, who had once declined Eve's invitation, now sat contentedly between two of the club members' wives, sharing stories as they stitched. The walls, once bare, now held colorful quilts and framed photographs of community events. Eve arranged books on the porch's free library shelves, smiling at the mix of well-loved paperbacks and children's stories donated by townspeople. A hand-painted sign read, "Take one, leave one," in bright letters. She adjusted Harold's old reading lamp that now illuminated the corner shelf during evening hours. The square bustled with Saturday morning activity. The bake sale table, stronger than ever after being rebuilt, displayed pies and cookies under a cheerful striped awning. 2 club members in leather vests helped an elderly woman set up her display, carefully arranging her famous apple tarts. Through the church windows, choir practice filled the air with hymns. Reverend Hale stood on the steps, watching as Cass helped unload boxes of donated goods for the community center. Their nods of acknowledgement, while not quite warm, carried none of the old tension. "Morning, Eve," Cass said, approaching the clubhouse with a paper cup of coffee, her usual order from the diner. Their fingers brushed as she took it, a small gesture that had become part of their comfortable routine. "The teens are coming by later," she reminded him, "for the mentoring program." He nodded, adjusting his jacket. The program had been his idea, though he'd been shy about proposing it. Now, twice a week, troubled kids found their way to the clubhouse where Cass taught them motorcycle maintenance and quiet lessons about respect. Eve touched the small gold locket in her apron pocket, Harold's last Christmas gift to her. Its familiar weight no longer brought sadness, just warm memories that sat comfortably alongside her new life. A young girl approached the bake sale table, eyeing the fresh muffins. Eve reached for one, still warm from the morning's baking. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said, handing it over with a genuine smile. The child beamed, chocolate already smudging her chin. Patch waved from across the square where he was helping hang banners for next week's festival. The town's rhythm had found a new balance, not perfect, but real. Like the rose bush taking root by the porch, it grew stronger each day. Eve stood in the morning light, Harold's locket in her pocket, watching her 2 worlds blend into something unexpected and good. Her smile, as she handed out another muffin to a passing child, held no trace of apology or doubt. This was home now, all of it, just as it was. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.